Yaroslav, welcome to TvAbraham. Shayna and I are super pleased to have you with us, and all of us are following your reporting from the Wall Street Journal as Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent. So we have a whole world to cover, and let's just get started.
Thank you for having me. Great to be on the show.
Let's talk about Ukraine, right, what's going on right now. Let's just agree between the three of us here, it's an existential war for Ukraine.
Absolutely is.
Absolutely is, right? Why is it that Ukraine is fighting, it has a very capable military, but it's fighting with basically middle-aged and older men? Why isn't it conscripting 18 to 25-year-olds?
Well, again, first of all, there's not that many of them. If you look at the demographic pyramid of Ukraine, the time when this 18 to 25-year-olds were supposed to be born is when Ukraine was in a complete economic and social crisis. So for every 20-year-old, there are 2 or 3 45-year-olds in Ukraine.
Really? Oh.
And that is the reason, same in Russia, by the way, because they all went through the same upheaval in the 1990s.
And Russia also isn't conscripting, is it?
No. And so, because you said this is an existential war.
Yes.
And because Ukraine sees it as a war for the survival of the Ukrainian nation, there is this political consensus that people who have not yet had children, people who are the future of the country, should be the last ones to be sent to this meat grinder. This pressure to send them to the front would only make sense if there is also equipment. It doesn't make sense to.
So they don't have enough equipment to.
Well, there's never enough equipment in the war. Obviously,
No.
Ukraine is outmatched.
Yeah.
By Russia. There's not enough ammunition, there's not enough armor, there is definitely not enough airplanes,
Right, well, yes.
And North Korea managed to supply the Russian military with more shells than the European Union.
If this is an existential war for Ukraine, which I think we can all agree, it's also a big threat to Europe. And of
Absolutely.
course, and yet, President Trump has a point here that the U.S. has provided more aid than Europe.
The European aid is larger than American aid in absolute numbers.
It depends what you count, of course.
Well,
but,
total aid, but also
but a lot of it's loans. It's not grants.
not a lot of not a lot of it is loans.
Right.
Most of it is grants.
Okay.
And a lot of it also, now increasingly so, is aid in the form of investment in Ukrainian military industries. But you're right. I mean, the Europeans are seeing this increasingly as an existential war for them too. Well, now is the moment of truth for Europe.
You're right.
And if you talk to European defense planners, including German ones, they will tell you very openly that they have the year 2029 on the calendars as the year when they think when Russia will be able to launch a full-scale war against the European Union, against countries in NATO and the EU right now. And
so you see them taking the steps necessary to defend themselves now?
Well, they are doing it now. They are doing, but it's also, look at the numbers, right? I mean, there is no future defense of Europe without Ukraine. Ukraine has an army of nearly 1 million men and women,
Yes.
which is more than the armies of Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, throw in a few others put together. And it's one of only 2 armies in the world that have actual experience fighting a modern, sophisticated, near-peer enemy. The other army with that experience is the Russian army. A Russian army that emerges victorious in Ukraine would be unstoppable in Europe unless the Ukrainian army is still there as a shield of Europe. And I think there is a growing realization of this in Europe, which is why so much money is now being channeled to Ukraine to develop the Ukrainian capabilities, especially in the fields like drones, which have revolutionized warfare and where Ukraine is, along Russia, one of the 2 world leaders in new technologies.
How does the UCOR likely end in your view?
Well,
What is the outline of that?
well, there are 2 issues, right? There is the issue of time and space. It's kind of clear now that Ukraine is not able to regain lost territories by force, and neither is Russia able to advance. So Russia controlled 19% of Ukraine a year and a half ago when it launched its offensive. It's been on the offensive for a year and a half. It lost 500,000 men and women, and it went from 19% to short of 20%. And so it's clear that some kind of settlement, if it happens, will have to recognize this reality, at least de facto. But the big question is then what happens next?
Yes.
And Russia's goal has never changed. Russia's goal since the very beginning was to exterminate Ukraine as an independent state formally or de facto. And so the Russian demands are, as voiced in the very first peace talks in Istanbul, and as apparently voiced again, are the disarmament of Ukraine, the elimination of the Ukrainian army, cutting it by 90%, removing all its heavy weapons and its ability to defend itself, and then a veto of Russia on any military help by anybody else. And that is something Ukraine cannot accept, because that is suicide.
You wrote about Trump's strategy, foreign experts are calling reverse Nixon.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about that wedge that they think he's trying to drive between Russia and Beijing?
Yeah, so if there are many reasons for the Trump foreign policy when it comes to Russia, but there are certainly foreign policy professionals in this administration who have been speaking for a while about this idea of a reverse Nixon, that is repeating this diplomatic breakthrough of Nixon and Kissinger in the 1970s, when they went to Beijing and managed to turn communist China away from the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So the idea here is that we will go and make friends with Putin and pry Russia away from China and undermine this axis that is formed of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. The problem with that is twofold.
Okay.
One is that China and the Soviet Union were actually in a conflict when this happened.
Right.
I mean, Russia and China now have the best relationship they have ever had. Russia is in no position to break with China because it would be a mortal danger to Russia, in part because Vladimir Putin knows that Donald Trump will not be president in 4 years' time, and he has no guarantee what sort of policy the next administration will adopt. But the other thing is also, Russia doesn't really have that much to bring to the table. China was this world's largest untapped market with an enormous potential. And Russia is a country with a shrinking population that is smaller than Bangladesh, and really nothing to put on the table except oil and gas that the U.S. already has in abundance.
Russia's population is smaller than Bangladesh.
It is.
Wow.
Yes. And it's shrinking.
There was a lot of interest in the Ukrainian war in the United States at the start. There was a lot of people putting up stickers, and they felt very strongly. That certainly has dropped off a lot because there are other stories, and people get fatigue. But can you remind people in this country why this war matters, not just to the Europeans, but for people here?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because you don't see this fatigue in Europe, and to that extent. And also in the U.S., this war became an ideological football between the Republicans and Democrats in a really weird way, in part because it's very far away and abstract. So people project their ideologies onto this, whereas in Europe, there are millions and millions of Ukrainians, and everyone knows that the Russians are next door, so it hasn't become that. But we're watching the bloodiest war in Europe since World War II. We're watching the biggest colonial war of the 21st century, and we're watching a war in which one founding member of the United Nations is trying to extinguish another. If Russia succeeds in wiping out another country, this is the end of the international order as we know it.
Let's talk about your book.
Yes.
I know Bob has it on his Kindle. I think it's going to be great for the camera.
The problem with Ukraine is that because its history has always been written by its conquerors, not to say its murderers, it's unknown to the rest of the world. And so I started writing this book when I was living in Kabul in 2014.
Wow.
When Russia first invaded Ukraine, and I was really flabbergasted by how much of the Russian narrative about Ukraine was being really bought wholesale by journalists, academics, and so it was all through that lens. And Ukrainian voices were silenced physically, throughout the centuries.
Intelligentsia were killed during the purges, right?
Exactly. So, but much more thoroughly than the Russian intelligentsia, because when I was growing up in Kiev as a teenager, no one knew about the Russian dissidents. There was always Samizdarov, Solzhenitsyn, and Bulgakov, and Mandelstam. But the Ukrainian executed Renaissance from the 1930s, who are characters in this book, they were unknown to us.
Is there a story about your grandmother you can share with us that stood out? Something that maybe tells the story of Ukraine in that story, or just about your family?
Well, it's really hard to, not to give away spoilers to this story, but it's a murder mystery.
Yep.
It's a love story. It's a story of a young woman who is born already in the Soviet system. So there is this dialogue throughout the book between her and her mother, Rebecca, who remembers the pre-Soviet time, and she's a reality check on her and says, well, like everything you think is normal is actually not normal. And I think it's very important for her to as a sounding board. And so this enthusiastic young woman comes to Kharkiv, who is the big city, the capital of Ukraine at the time.
Yeah.
They're building skyscrapers there. She meets all this new Ukrainian intellectual class. And then all her hopes and aspirations just hit this wall of reality. And she has to survive all the horrors that befall Ukraine at the time. And so it's really an examination of all the compromises you have to make and where do you draw the line.
It's a great book, No Country for Love.
No Country for Love, yes.
And congratulations on it.
Thank you. And I hope you'll read it.
We will. Thank you, Yaroslav, for joining us.
Yes, thank you very much. We really
Thank you.
appreciate it.